Hey, Jim, can you, yeah, yes, yes, yes. It'll have to do, okay? For now, that'll have to do. We'll rearrange it later. What is going on, guys? So today we are back with another video. We're actually going to be doing versus videos for the next 2 days. So today being Saturday, tomorrow being Sunday, we are going to be taking a look at some videos where we compare two Pokemon head to head to kind of see which one is better. Now, you may have noticed something a little different. And yeah, so I got to give some credit to this guy. I didn't write down the name before I started recording. Basically, after I did the whole setup with these two boards, it got brought up that maybe I should do like one large board here. Now, what I do eventually want to do is actually, this board right here, this particular board is crap. So, like, you can't really, I mean, you can ride on it, but it's got a lot of scratches. It's got a lot of like crap on it. So I kind of want to get rid of this entirely. So next go around, I will buy another black matching dry erase board, and I'll get a matching set to go over there, so that'll be pretty sweet. But basically now we have a larger format for whenever we're looking at PV Poke, spreadsheets, you know, whatever we need to be looking at. We've got an entire board dedicated to that now, whereas instead of having two small panels across the entire setup, we have an entire giant board. And today we have a versus video, of course, so you should see, like, I don't know, what do we put over here? Some spaghetti, and how about some pancakes? Well, let's just do Venusaur and Ivysaur since those are the topics for today. So today, actually, since we are going to be doing a versus video, I'll go ahead and let you know. We are doing Venusaur versus Ivysaur. Now, this one is a pretty hot topic. So the first thing that you really want to know whenever you compare Venusaur and Ivysaur is that basically they both have carbon copy of each other's moves, except Venusaur actually has access to Frenzy Plant, while Ivysaur actually has access to Power Whip. Frenzy Plant versus Power Whip is kind of similar, but not extremely close. Frenzy Plant does inch out in both energy cost and in damage, while Power Whip actually isn't far behind, but it still doesn't do quite as well. So that actually makes these two Pokemon very similar whenever we get into actually looking at matchups and things. You do also have the debate whether you want to run Razor Leaf or whether you want to run Frenzy Plant. So I will flat out say that I believe Vine Whip is the move to run on Venusaur all day long. Getting to this Frenzy Plant is literally what you want to do. That's just the entire purpose of your Venusaur. If you are running the Ivysaur though, it possibly could be debated that Razor Leaf has a situation. So Razor Leaf is basically just going to be a powerhouse. It lets you kind of go at certain Pokemon while being able to just farm up the energy. And it's not really like farming out that energy either. I mean, with Razor Leaf, you're basically going to be able to go after some Pokemon, and at the end of that matchup, if you were able to win it, you should by the end of it have enough to fire off a charge move. So it's kind of a different play style. Vine Whip on Ivysaur is kind of like the Fast and Furious, if you will, whereas on Razor Leaf, it's kind of like the low rider of the situation, because with Vine Whip, you're going to be like going after like your charge moves, and you're going to be wanting to fire those off, whereas Razor Leaf is you're kind of just like relaxed and you're kind of just throwing out some Razor Leafs and, oh hey, I actually do have a charge move now, let's do that. So it's kind of not as like hectic, I guess, but it really just depends on your play style. For the purposes of this video though, we did go with Vine Whip on both Venusaur and on Ivysaur. Whether that's the one that you run or not, it's up to you. Now let's actually get started looking at some stats here. So with Venusaur and Ivysaur, comparing bulk and stat product here, Venusaur actually is 35th and 29th respectively, while Ivysaur actually beats us here. It's actually 28th and 23rd. So we actually have better bulk and better stat product with Ivysaur than we do with Venusaur. Now, of course, that comes from our base stats here with a 198 on attack, 189 on defense, and 190 on stamina for a Venusaur. We actually end with a 151, 143, and 155 on Ivysaur? How does that work? Well, so the way that your stats are actually calculated is based on a CP multiplier. I do plan on doing a video in the distant future. It's not kind of like anytime soon. I'm trying to like set up this series of videos, which if you've paid close enough attention, you probably know what they are by now, but I will do a video on that eventually. But basically, the CP multiplier allows us to get more out of our base stats in this Ivysaur because we do have to power it up to a higher level, whereas with Venusaur, we don't get to power it up quite that far, so we actually have to take a hit on our stats here, which is actually why we actually have a better bulk and stat product worked out there. Now for Venusaur, like we said, we are going to go with Vine Whip, then we're going to have Sludge Bomb and Frenzy Plant. For our Ivysaur, we are going to have Vine Whip, Sludge Bomb, and Power Whip this time, just to kind of round out our moveset there for Ivysaur. So jumping straight into our shields here, on our 0 versus 0, this is where neither myself nor my opponent actually have any shields, kind of like a closing type situation. Basically, Venusaur takes it with a 66.3 there. That's not super surprising considering that Frenzy Plant is going to be just a tad bit faster than our Power Whip here, and this is going to kind of become a theme here. So in the 2 versus 0, you do see that 91.3 versus that 87 flat, so Ivysaur does lose there as well. In this 0 versus 2, we actually have a 9.8, unfortunately not a double digit, but we do actually have an 8.7 on the Ivysaur, so doing just a little bit worse. Then we do have on our 2v2 this 47.8 versus a 46.7. And in our 1v1, we do have the 64.1 versus the 54.3. So, Venusaur actually inches out every single time compared to Ivysaur here. And that's kind of going to be a theme throughout this video. I mean, Venusaur with Frenzy Plant has just like that slightest bit of edge in a lot of scenarios. Alright, so now we're actually going to be looking at the entire meta that is defined by PvPoke. We're actually going to be taking all of our battle ratings here and comparing them one-on-one. We should have our list of Pokemon here on the furthest left column. Then we have Venusaur and Ivysaur. And in that last column down there, we do have which one actually does better in those scenarios. So up against the Azumarill, you can actually see that Venusaur actually does end up taking it just slightly over Ivysaur. Both Pokemon do end up winning against the Azumarill, so that is a-okay there. You shouldn't have a problem, but Venusaur will actually do better there. Up against the Beedrill, Venusaur actually does better here again, but both Pokemon end up fainting, so not too drastic. Blastoise, we do have wins on both sides. Venusaur actually taking that one as well. Charizard, though, we actually do equally the same against Charizard, both losing, so neither one actually does better. Up against the Execute, we do have our first little variance here. So Ivysaur actually does better and actually ties up against the Execute, whereas Venusaur would just flat out lose. Very interesting. Then up against the Executor, we do both lose there, with Ivysaur actually doing just a little bit better. Then we do have Fortress, which Venusaur actually is doing better there, just slightly, all still losing those last few matches there. Then we do get up against the Ivysaur ourselves. With this moveset, we actually do pretty good. Now, PvPoke does stick Ivysaur with Razor Leaf by default for the meta pick, so take that into consideration here. We do win here, and Ivysaur actually does better up against itself than Venusaur does. Then we move on to the Kingdra, which Venusaur does better in. We both win though. Lantern with Water Gun. We do actually win there, both Pokemon, but Venusaur is doing better. Venusaur doing better up against the Lapras and the Magcargo. Then we actually start to lose up against this Mantine, but you can see that Venusaur has a lot easier of a time than Ivysaur does. Almost tying with the Venusaur, but Ivysaur pretty much gets wrecked there. Then we have the Meganium, which, as you can see, Venusaur actually does better there. Ninetales, we both lose, just barely though. Venusaur actually does do a tad bit better. Then we have the Quagsire, which, interestingly enough, Venusaur does really good up against, but Ivysaur actually ends up tying, which is kind of interesting. Then we actually do have the Raichu, which Ivysaur actually does better in, but we do both win there. And then Slowbro and Venomoth, we are losing both of those with both Pokemon, but Ivysaur actually does better in the Slowbro matchup, while it's an exact tie in the Venomoth. Then up against the Venusaur, we both do tie up against the Venusaur ourselves. And then we do have that Victory Bell with a win on both, but Venusaur actually does better. So in total, Venusaur actually does better than Ivysaur 13 times out of the cup, and then 5 times does Ivysaur actually do better? The other unaccounted times are for those same matchups there. It should only be 3 of those. That's an interesting thought though. I mean, it's crazy that Venusaur does that much better up against the meta rather than Ivysaur. Then let's actually take it a step further. Let's actually let PvPoke actually choose the preferred moveset up against these 2 Pokemon, and let's see how good they actually do up against that. So this is actually up against every single Pokemon. Now we're not going to go through all of these of course, but we are going to take some notes on a couple of these. So I really would just want to point out the ones that it's a drastic difference whether one Pokemon flat out wins versus one Pokemon flat out either ties or loses. So you can kind of see our first one that we have is Cloyster, where Venusaur would actually flat out win it, whereas Ivysaur actually ties. Then we scroll down, we actually can see Gloom is a very similar situation where Venusaur actually ends up winning and Ivysaur ties again. Then the Golduck and Growlithe, Venusaur is tying, whereas Ivysaur does flat out lose. Then we go down to the Magby. You know, it's not really worth saying, but hey, Venusaur wins that. Magmar, though, we actually do have a tie with Venusaur, whereas Ivysaur is a flat-out loss. Then we have Magneton, very interesting, that Magneton can actually end up beating our Ivysaur, but our Venusaur can actually end up beating it. That one's kind of important. Then we go down to the Politoed there. You can see Politoed is a win for Venusaur, but a tie for Ivysaur. Then we have Ponyta. Okay, it's a tie for Venusaur and a loss for Ivysaur. Then we go down to Quagsire, which is a flat-out win for Venusaur, which we've talked about already, and a tie for Ivysaur. And then we go down to Rapidash, very similar story. Seaking's very similar. Slowpoke, though, Slowpoke is our one that Ivysaur is doing better. So far, we're actually doing better up against Slowpoke than Venusaur would. Starmie, though, flip that around. We actually do better with Venusaur than we would with Ivysaur, actually winning with that Venusaur. Then we do have the Typhlosion, where Ivysaur actually does just a tad bit better. Then up against the Vileplume, which seems to be the last one that we have a drastic change, we do tie with Ivysaur versus just flat out losing with Venusaur. All that said, though, you do actually have 56 different instances where Venusaur is actually going to be doing better than Ivysaur across all of the Pokemon, the entire Rainbow Cup. So only 26 scenarios there is Ivysaur going to be doing better. So this kind of changes things a little for me, because I really felt like Ivysaur was pretty much toe-to-toe with Venusaur. But after looking at this, it's not as like clear-cut as I thought. Venusaur seriously does some crazy high numbers compared to Ivysaur. It's not quite as cut and dry as I had hoped. So that being said, I do think that Venusaur is definitely going to be the better option, but if you have Ivysaur, the thing that I kind of see as a trend here is if there's any case where bulk matters, I think Ivysaur really starts to shine there. The problem is that just because bulk matters, we're not able to output enough damage like Venusaur would, so it comes up less often. Just if Venusaur had Power Whip here, if we were comparing the exact same movesets, Ivysaur would win most of these, I guarantee it. Because it does have the higher bulk, it would probably end up doing a lot better compared to the Venusaur. But because Venusaur has Frenzy Plant, holy cow, does it propel it to crazy heights here. 56 times out of the entire cup is Venusaur going to do better. Take that for what you will. Do with that information what you will, because that's pretty crazy to me that Venusaur is that much better. But if you're like me and you do not have a Frenzy Plant Venusaur, then you gotta kind of figure out what you're gonna do at this point, right? Ivysaur is very comparable, don't get me wrong. It has a lot of similarities here. There are a few instances like in that Politoed where we tie instead of win, the Quagsire we tie instead of win. There are several instances like that, but there are a ton of places where we actually end up going very similarly to the Venusaur. It's just that we don't quite do enough, and it ends up giving us a lot of problems. So, do we run with Ivysaur? Do we go with something like Victory Bell? Do we go with something like Gloom? It's kind of an interesting question at this point. I'm really interested to see what you guys think about Venusaur versus Ivysaur. Hopefully you guys have gotten the picture by now, but please vote for any deep dives that you have, because next up on the list currently is Suicune, and if you guys really want to see that, hey, that's fine with me. I'll do it. I'm not opposed to it. But if you guys do not want to see that, then please vote down below. Otherwise, that should be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for hanging out. Thank you so much for watching. Always remember that if you like to like videos, you can do that. But if you don't, you could be that guy. Otherwise, let me know what you have to say down in those comments below. And until our next video, I will catch you then.